Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Show Me the Money. This is where we get into the really fun stuff, right? We found out how you get your rights to the film that you want to make. We've figured out where you want to make it. You've sent people to the ground. You've decided where you're going to shoot. So how do we develop this thing? How do we finance it? How do we produce it? How do we deliver it and get it actually shown to the world? That's what this episode is going to be all about. Actually, the next couple episodes. Mm-hmm. So, Sam, I guess first we're starting off with development, right?
Thank you, John. Yes. Well, essentially, though, let's just do an overall of what is actually happening when you make a film. The first stage, these are the stages of production or phases of production. The stage of production that we find most of our clients in is called development, okay? That development is before you actually have your film financed and you're basically creating the story, you're basically moving it forward, you're trying to get it financed, you're getting a budget, you're getting people cast into it and so forth, right? That's the development stage. After that development stage, then you actually have to produce the film. That's called, the finance. Well, you have to finance that film, but once it's financed, that's still part of development. But it's a secondary part of development is financing it itself, and then you have to produce it. And the producing of it is the actual physical manufacturing of a film, which requires that you've got your locations going. If you're in a studio, you got to do studio stuff, okay? So you've got to set it all up. That's called the pre-production stage of it, okay? From that pre-production stage, then there's one thing that they use an expression. It's called the first day of principal photography. That is really when you're beginning to have an actual live on your screen, on your basic cinema, the images that first begin to get taken, and that's called production itself. The first day of principal photography often triggers many events because those are the key aspect that film is actually happening, okay? And then you have the last day of principal photography, which means that all of your film has been shot itself. It used to be shot on film, actual negative films. Now, most of the time, it's shot on digital, etc. So once you've finished actually producing and photographing your film, okay, you go into what is called post-production. In post-production, that stage deals with the fact that now all those images have to be edited together, put in together and into one concise film itself. And many times, especially these days, most of your film happens to be not even shot. It has to be created by creating these special effects and things that you don't even see on screen any longer. That's still part of what we call post-production. Once all of the post-production is done, you literally have a film. That film now has to be delivered because when you made your film, you promised lots of people that you would give them the film, and you maybe had a broadcaster, you had a distributor, you had a sales agent, and so forth. That film now has to be actually delivered. And in fact, in what we see often, delivery is a complex situation of hard elements and soft elements itself, and the producer ends up delivering the film all around the world. And from that delivery, that makes it possible for consumers, for you and I, to actually see the film. And that part is the exploitation of the film, the distribution of the film, the exhibition of the film, if it's going to be on theatrical films, if it's going to be on Netflix or on a streaming type situation, if it's going to be on TV for TV films and so forth, that becomes the distribution or exploitation of the film. So those are all the phases of the life of the film itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into development, do you want to...
I think the first thing you'd want to do, because you're taking on such a huge task, is you may want to start with a glass of wine.
Let's do it.
And as you know, we've always have Shelburne Vineyard, who is our companion partner on this podcast. And we're still working on that Marquette red wine. And I'll pour you another little bit of wine on that side. Because the journey requires a little bit of logic, but also sometimes a little bit of emotion. And what better way to start?
Exactly.
Both a logical and emotional journey than with a glass of wine, which was developed, produced, and distributed and delivered. Same types of situation, maybe. Making wine, making a film.
Very good. All right, so now we're going to get into development of a film, right? And where we're going to start off, it's a little familiar because we've talked about it already. It's creation, acquisition, marketing, and we've touched on some of these elements. Now, you okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
It's these chairs. As good as they are, sometimes there's a little mishap. Do we have?
Did I have insurance on that?
You just took the words right out of my mouth, right? All right. So you have your film, and you basically have your film that you want to get made, and now you need rights. So I'm going to refer us back to chain of title documents, right? We're not going to re-explore that. You could refer back to episode 1. But chain of title is effectively all the documents you need to establish that you have the rights to shoot the film. The next big question, though, is once you have the rights is, okay, I have the rights. Maybe I have an idea. Maybe I have an underlying property, like a book that I want to base a script on. But like, I need money now to push this thing forward, right? I don't even need to finance the movie yet because we're just not there. We need to, let's say, I'll give you the following example. I need money to hire a writer to turn this idea into a script. So where do I get this money from? And at this stage, especially if you're an independent producer, it tends to be cobbled together from a bunch of different sources.
Yeah, we spoke about tax credits. Tax credits are not available at the development stage.
Exactly. So where are you getting the money? Sometimes it's a little bit of your own. Sometimes it's some friends. Go to your buddies. Sometimes it's family money, which is referred to very often as love money. Sometimes it's crowdfunding. Other times it's institutions. Crowdfunding is an interesting one, and it was really en vogue in 2013, 2014. I
think it's still there, actually. I think there's Indiegogo now. Still has a lot of films that they support, right?
It's Indiegogo, and there was one other one. What was it called? Kickstarter, yeah.
But I think Indiegogo has probably more films, if I remember correctly.
But the way crowdfunding effectively works is you are going to a bunch of people and asking them to pitch into your project. And it's not an investment. Something called equity crowdfunding came out later where it was actually hard investment. And somebody who equity crowdfunded your film could expect a return. However, crowdfunding as a general concept has been used basically to say, hey guys, I'm trying to make this project. Can you help me out? And very often there's all kinds of perks awarded, right? So for example, you'll say...
we're looking at Indiegogo right now. Here, you have someone who did funding called Burren Girl Documentary Film on it. They raised 27,000 Canadian dollars. And it's an interesting concept because you didn't used to have that before.
But I think the reason why it has worked in some cases, in other cases, it really has not. What it's based on, in my view, is the fact that everyone wants to make movies. Movies are really cool. At least if you're me, movies are really cool, right? But not everyone can just show up in Hollywood and say, hey guys, can I come make a movie? It's a somewhat gated industry. It's very hard to get in. So crowdfunding, what it very often does is it says, hey guys, I want you to get involved in my movie. And by the way, if you give me this much money, if you crowdfund us this much, you get a thank you credit. If you crowdfund this much, you get a thank you credit and an opportunity to come to the premiere and meet everyone.
They call that a perk over here.
It's a perk. And if you give me this much, you get to be an executive producer, right? So it really is that it can be viewed to some as an opportunity to get into the industry. I know there are some other actual established people in the industry who have tried crowdfunding and it has not gone so well because they were a little more well-heeled. And people just said, why don't you use your own money? But the more interesting thing that happened is crowdfunding then merged into, or what emerged was equity crowdfunding, which is effectively a different model, which says rather than just being purely donative, you're investing money, right?
Yeah. They came about because originally, when you do your crowdfunding campaign, what you're working on is those perks. Usually, those perks couldn't be a share of the film because it was a security, and you'd be in violation of different securities acts if you offer someone a share of profits or revenues based on the fact that they gave you money. Okay, so initially, what people, and they're still doing, is so you've got a choice. You can either tell someone, hey, give me some money, I'll give you a DVD, or I'll give you a download of the film, or I'll mention your name on screen, or I'll give you a T-shirt or something like that, okay? Versus I'll give you 10%, 1% of the share of the profits of this film. So what you now have the ability in the United States and even in Canada is to actually do call it mini type of prospectus, offering memorandum, and literally raise money by offering people that share. It's quite complex, though. It really doesn't work as easy as the Kickstarters and the Indiegogo crowdfunding. You still have to go through a pretty legal process, okay, of preparing contracts and filing them with the Securities Commission and getting exemptions and so forth. So it's still quite difficult to just do equity crowdfunding.
Right.
That's all.
So maybe now I have my funds, right? I have my funds to get the ball rolling.
There's one other place that many independent filmmakers go to, and that's institutions. What they do is there's a lot of programs out there. And Canada is pretty known for this, where you've got entities like SODEC in Quebec, Telefilm across Canada. There's even some funds that have been set up by broadcasters and other agencies, like the Shaw has a fund, which is and Rogers has a fund, and these are broadcasters in Canada that set up funds so that people can access money for their development and for part of it, their financing. The Harold Greenberg Fund itself had set up money. So these institutional type of backings are sometimes another place to go.
Right. So now maybe you have some funds, right? Mm-hmm. So the question is, what's next? Mm-hmm. What's next very often in the indie world is people try to garner some interest in the film, right? Maybe they try to obtain something called a pre-sale, which is effectively a commitment from a distributor that they will pre-buy the rights into this movie. And the money that they pay you is triggered by all sorts of things, right? Mm-hmm. Usually it's a percentage of that money upon signature, a small one, let's say 10, 20% is customary, and then the rest on delivery of the picture. Now, this is where it gets fun. Where do these pitches happen, right? Mm-hmm. Where do you get pre-sales? Mm-hmm. That's in Cannes. It's at TIFF.
Well, I would say to you, and now I'm just calling up the website of the Festival de Cannes, which is happening between May 12th and 23rd, 2020. So for you that are planning to have your film script ready by that time, you could go and appear. And so it's like any other area. It's a market. It's essentially where sellers are meeting buyers, okay, and trying to sell or pre-sell their film. In certain cases, those films are already made, and that's why it's a festival of exhibition of films themselves. But it's also a meeting place where films, before they're made, are actually being negotiated. And in Cannes, if you look over here, what's happening is, even though there's glitters of actors and big producers and major, first-time premieres and so forth, all around that area of the La Croisette, which is this sort of, strip of hotels that goes from the Palais de Festival over to the other end of the bay in Cannes, is thousands of people who are just literally trying to get their film financed. They're basically arriving with a script. Sometimes that script actually has an actor attached to it, maybe even a director. And that has a very important role, right?
We're going to get into that. Yeah. So you're in this pre-sale phase, right? And one thing that I think is important to distinguish between is there's film festivals, right? Like Telluride, for example, is a film festival. But as far as I know, there's no market component, right? So a festival is more about screening the film, the artistic component. A market, though, is more like you mentioned, a meeting place. Market in the truest sense of the word. Sometimes, though, markets and festivals merge, right? Like TIFF or like Cannes, and that's where it gets a bit confusing, right? Because they both show films, but they also function as marketplaces.
Well, here we are. This is the most inspiring film market. Again, Marché du Film of the Cannes one of the major markets. You also mentioned the one of TIFF. So Cannes has this sort of really grand setting in the French Riviera. TIFF actually occurs in Toronto. And Toronto itself, because of the fact that Canada has established itself as really a big center for production, okay, it made logical sense that you'd create a market here and you'd create a festival to exhibit films over here. And again, one of the things, like you mentioned, is what's the big advantage? Well, Toronto happens to be a few hours from New York, right? And also a few hours from Los Angeles. So you were able in Toronto to attract a lot of the major film studios, okay, and a lot of the independents, because as Canadians, I think one of the things we do value a lot is independent filmmaking. So you can travel in the springtime to Cannes. You can travel in the summertime to the Toronto Film Festival, and in the sort of fall, winter time, or just before winter time, there's another market called the American Film Market, which occurs every year in Santa Monica. Last year, in 2019, it happened from November 6th to 13th. It usually happens sometimes in November. So you would be basically trying to get your film at each one of these places. And I think another one is South by Southwest.
Well, South by is more a festival. There's Berlin in February, right?
Berlin,
South
okay.
by is in March.
Yeah. And what about Sundance?
So Sundance is, as far as I know, it's a pure festival, right?
No, but aren't they trying to get films also done? So you've got all these, every single probably month of the year, you can find yourself at a different film festival.
You have told me, John, you could spend your entire life at film festivals, right? Which I think would be an awesome life, but...
it could be. We wouldn't get our job done. But
No. But, if you're lucky enough.
Yeah. But so that's your stage. You're pitching it. This is your development stage. This is part of the development. It's an important part because these markets, there are deals happening. And I originally, when I had gone many, many years ago, just as a lawyer, I wasn't buying or selling films themselves, but my clients were there. And that first year that I went, the first couple of days, nothing really happened, okay? And we were leaving on the last day back to Montreal, and I said, let me swing by the market this morning, okay, before we ended up leaving. And basically, I arrive at the Lowe's, I walk in, and I noticed there was a Canadian that I had done some work with, and he introduces me. He says, hey, you want to meet this guy who's, working on a film from Los Angeles and is thinking of coming to Canada. And that day ended up creating literally the foundation for a film producer that ended up doing maybe at least 3 or 4 films within a couple of years after that, which I ended up getting because I drove by that last day on the market in Santa Monica.
Well, and I think what you were saying, I'm a huge baseball fan. I'd love the Expos to come back. Yeah. But when I used to play in Little League, there was this saying, put the ball into play, right? So you need to have your toes tapping all the time. Opportunity comes at...
You don't know where it's coming from.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've got just don't know.
Sometimes you've been someplace, you've met somebody years before, okay? And then they give you a call.
Exactly. In these markets, like you and I went to AFM over the past 2 years, there is just this notion that it's a confluence of a bunch of people who are trying to do similar stuff, and there's synergies that just pop up. And it's very interesting for us to see as lawyers, but it's also really interesting for producers, right? And potential people trying to get their films made, right? Because you have not only producers or content creators in the same place, but you have financiers, you have distributors, you have lawyers, accountants.
Oh, we're working there.
Yeah.
People think that you're on the Pacific Ocean in Santa Monica having sipping sangria, or at the Mediterranean having some wine. The wine we're having here, we're basically working and running from one place to another place, and with all those other producers who are running and working and trying to get their film financed or picked up, or even in certain cases, just interested by an actor or an agent or so forth.
Exactly. So the next point is, maybe you've pitched, you have your funds to start your development, but you've gotten some interest from someone, right? Like, let's say it's an independent distributor. Let's say it's a distributor, right? A US distributor, for example. So what do I now need to do? For me, the next place to start is prepare your budget, right? Now,
well, your film has a cost. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. And that cost has to be broken down.
Right. And you make the simile, you make the comparison to, winemaking, right? There's making wine, and then there's making movies, right?
That's it.
A movie is a business. Each movie is its own business.
And those budgets are something that, there's an enormous variation between a $60 million film versus a $3 million film. They all need to go through the same process, okay? They all need to be done, okay? But the difference is often in who's in the film and who you're getting in the film.
Exactly.
In a budget itself, you have what is called the above the line part of the budget, and there's the below the line part of the budget. Above the line is probably the most varied component of the film. What does above the line mean? It means, if you look at it, it's the key creative components. So you've got your story, you've got your script writer, you've got your main producer itself, you've got the director of the film, and you've got the key stars of the film. So just think about it. I could hire, an unknown actor for what is called union scale, right? A few $1,000s a week or something that you can pay an actor, right? Or I can try to get maybe one of the top leading A-list actors in the world, and I'd have to pay them $20 million.
I'm also going to add in one in between, which we'll talk about more in a minute. There is an in between, which is I could get someone very recognizable who is not the leading star. And very often, because they love my project, they will act for scale, slightly above scale. So that's above the line. What about below the line?
The below the line, if you look at it, is actually the cost of making the picture. In other words, there's what we call the fabrication cost of making the picture. A film itself actually requires that you have sets, and that you have cameras, and that you have technicians, and that you have lighting, and that you have, all that. That part is what we call the below the line component. That aspect of it varies significantly because it depends on your scene. In other words, if your scene requires that you crash a helicopter, right, or blow up something, well, that will cost a lot more than if you have a scene where it's you and I having a discussion over wine, right, about the film industry. That cost is very different than it would be if I had a movie that has, a lot of, call it either action scenes, okay, or special effects components of it. So that below the line varies based on what your story is and how complex it is to actually get it on a screen. The other part of the budget is what we call cash budgets and deferrals, and we have, soft costs that are also affecting, which are costs that are not going on your screen. Your soft costs are going to be your legal costs, your insurance costs, your finance costs, your interest costs, and so forth. And those are other elements that are required, but they don't necessarily appear on screen. In fact, our cost as lawyers doesn't appear on screen. So that's why sometimes we have resistance by some film producers to really hire us early on, because we don't actually contribute to the screen itself. But we are essential, from my point of view, to actually making that film happen. But the other costs in a film is that you, as the producer, you as the people who are involved in creating this film, should get paid, because you're making this film for a reason, right? You're not making this film and spending your time for charity. So often you have what are called the producer fees, and you've got overheads, and you've got potentially items in this budget which can be what we call deferred, in the sense that I don't necessarily need to do my film to have my fee financed, my overheads financed, or possibly some of my partners who want to come on board finance. So we could potentially get a film done where we get some people who want to come in and they agree to defer their fee. And that allows the film to actually happen and be financed, or we use the expression greenlit, right? Greenlighting a film means that you've reached enough finances to cover what is called the cash cost of the film, the cash budget. So you can greenlight the film, get it going, okay, even though you aren't 100% financed. And that's because in the film industry, there's a little magic, what we had called, right, is that aspect of the fact that that film contains part of that budget items which themselves are either payable to you, the filmmaker, or payable to other people who are willing to come on board and not get paid right away.
Exactly. And that amount, typically, customarily, it's about 10% of your budget. Right?
You can go with 10. Well, there's different rules on it, but the Canadian government and some of the Canadian agencies have stated that 10% is reasonable for film producers to charge for making films. And that's when they support a film, they will look at that criteria. In Hollywood, that rule doesn't have to exist. You could be making more money than that if you are able to get the money, the financing for it. So it's just a question of this was something that was actually set up by agencies and so forth because they didn't want, when they were supporting films, to just be financing a producer who takes 50% of the film or something.
Right. Yeah. So we have our budget, and you talked a bit about above the line. Now the question is, who's going to be in our movie, right?
Mm-hmm.
People love actors. They love stars. It's the glitz and glam of Hollywood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And every era has had the leading man or leading woman who's just magnetic. And traditionally, these have been the people who drive the success or failure of a film, or one of them at least. Lately, I think it's less so, but that's really just a matter of opinion. The question that I get a lot, though, Sam, like from first-time producers, is, okay, how do I get in touch with an actor? How do I get the interest of an actor? You mentioned, for example, if I want to go to Cannes, it's great to have an actor, quote, attached to a film. Maybe they've signed a letter of intent saying, I currently intend to act in this film, but I'm a first-time producer. How do I get in touch? Who are the gatekeepers? And in my view...
Every actor who has any type of value, okay, and let's look on screen right now. We have George Clooney, right? Okay. He's one of the A-list actors, okay? And this is called the Hollywood Stock Exchange, okay? So technically, this is a fictitious exchange, okay? You've got him...
Are they allocating value to each of the
what they're
stars?
He has a TAG, right? Average gross of his films is $9,400,000. So that's basically, a way to monitor what's happening, on who is popular in an industry. And that is based on the fact that what that actor is generating as revenues from their films. Now, the people who are those gatekeepers is essentially the agencies, the top agencies. You have got CAA, okay, who is one of the biggest agencies, WME, et cetera. Those agents themselves are representing these actors. And those agents themselves are driven by the title of this podcast, which is called Show Me the Money.
Thanks so much for listening, everyone, and stay tuned.
Right.